There's one question I get asked a lot, and I think it's because it's not discussed or really thought about. And it's this simple: how good or not good is Steve Smith as an ODI player? The T20 question with him has been answered long ago, although recent Big Bash seasons he's tried to reopen it. His test career was go-to before sandpaper or Joffre's bouncer. But as a 50 over dude, he stands somewhere in the middle, a little bit like the format himself. Two World Cup medals should validate greatness more often than not. But in an era where white ball cricket has evolved faster than a Pokemon on meth, an average of 43 complicates things a little bit. A strike rate of 87 also isn't groundbreaking. Steve Smith's 50 over career in Australian shirt amassed 170 games across 15 years, which tells you a lot about ODI's decreasing popularity and perhaps how Australia hasn't always used their best players. 5,800 runs in 154 innings with 12 tons and 35 50s. It's significant, but if you look at him on the all-time list, it puts him around Ramiz Raja and Ramnaresh Sharwan. Not exactly the same level of talent as Steve Smith. And Virat Kohli has scored more runs in singles than Steve Smith has all runs in ODI cricket. For a man known for making runs, he just hasn't made a lot in the 50 overs. And yet, the two World Cup wins, plenty of incredible innings, his legacy is still yet at best complicated. His retirement from the format didn't end with like an outpouring of emotion, even from the many smudge heads out there on the internet who are obsessed with his every knock. He was kind of yawned into 50 overs pension. But he did play it and won a lot. So how good was Steve Smith at cricket's middle child format?
As a cricket journalist, I would travel sometimes up to 200 days a year. I loved watching cricket games. I loved going to new countries. It was an absolute dream. But there was one thing I hated more than anything else about it, and it was this little pin. The thing that I need to change my SIM card in every new country. The absolute worst thing about this pin and SIM cards is when I was traveling to the West Indies, of having to arrive in every new island or country and having to work out if I could still find this pin and then line up and get my SIM card in every single airport. Well, now we have the answer thanks to Sally. They can make it so you never have to worry about this nonsense ever again. They use an eSIM app that once you install once, it is easy, simple, and cheap. Oh, and it works in more than 160 countries. And you can throw these pins away forever, because now you just need to download the Sally app before your trip. And if you do it with our code, Good Areas, you get an exclusive 15% discount on Sally eSIM data plans. So before your next holiday or work trip or any time you have to travel to another country, download the Sally app and use the code Good Areas, or one word, at checkout, and you can travel like a pro with Sally.
Steve Smith made his ODI debut all the way back in February of 2010. He was only 20 at the time, and he was brought into the team partly to bowl wrist spin and also to bat in the lower order, which is exactly like in Test. The one different in ODI cricket is that I think there was also a part of it that he was such a great fielder. So Australia thought they had a three-tool player into the future. And in his first 25 innings, he managed 431 runs, an average of 21, and a strike rate of 91. No 50s, no 100s. As I said, batting all the way down the order. In fact, 15 of them came at number 7. For casual fans, Shane Warne was a mere Shane Warne impersonator who could bat a little bit and take the odd catch. In fact, many of the highlights from him early in his career were just taking an absolute screamer in the ring. However, he changed those perceptions after he was promoted to bat at 3 versus South Africa in September of 2014. In the next 9 innings, he scored 490 runs, including 2 tons and 350s. This was actually after his breakthrough in Test, so he had a very good 2013 and a very good 2014 in Test matches, and eventually they just went, stuff it, let's try him at the top of the order. But it's quite clear Australia weren't as sure of him in this format. In the 2 years that followed, Smith averaged north of 50 in ODIs and added 5 more tons while also winning a World Cup at home. At this point, ODIs kind of suited him. You couldn't get him out, and it was before the middle over scoring revolution. So he could do his thing without anyone really complaining or noticing. However, afterwards, his batting average actually dropped below 45 by 2017. He struggled again in 2018, not just with the sandpaper gate, but in the few ODIs that he played. And then he went under 38 in 2019 when he came back, which was another World Cup year. It's also unsure at times how much he cared for ODI cricket. In Tests, it looked like he wanted to bat forever. I don't think it ever felt like that in the 50-over game. In 2022, however, something completely inspired him. He averaged 63 and struck it over 106. 2 back-to-back 62 ball tons against India were the forefront of a worldy year. And they were scored against an attack that featured Jasprit Bumrah and Mohammad Shami. For a player who often plodded through, he seemed to have found a real purpose and style at that point. But weirdly, that was it. For instance, 2020 remains the only year he scored at more than a run a ball. In 2022, he had his best average in the calendar year, 4 more runs per dismissal than 2020, but his strike rate dropped to 81. Did he lose his scoring ability to COVID? Because it looked like he was unlocking something special, and since then, he's gone back to solid accumulation. A natural regression followed, and he never scored another 100 in that format. The true values paint a similar picture. From 2014 to 2016, his true averages were in the 15 to 20 range, and he was about a neutral or slight positive when it comes to true strike rate. He had a faster scoring year in 2020 with a true average and true strike rate of around 13, while in 2022 was the one where he had a true average of 46 and a strike rate of 4. However, he left a lot to be desired on either side of those years. And that really sums up his ODI career. Just when you think he's hitting his ODI peak, that streak just kind of completely finishes. The other question we had was Smith a home track bully? It's a statement that obviously doesn't hold true in Test cricket, but 50 overs paints a completely different picture. In Australia, he batted 60 times at an average of just under 57 with a strike rate of 93. That is great in any language at any time in ODI cricket. He also made 9 of his 12 ODI tons in Australia. Away from home, he averaged mid-30s, striking in the low 80s, which is mediocre, especially for someone of his talent. The only venues where he averaged over 50 were the UAE and the Caribbean, and that was only 10 combined innings. Beyond those regions, Smith couldn't manage an ODI batting above 40 across the globe, which again, just doesn't really make sense. And when you look at the opposition teams, unsurprisingly, his record versus India is spectacular. Clearly, someone from India did something to him in a past life. He averages nearly 59 against them in tests and just 5 runs less in ODIs. And 5 of his 12 tons have come against them. One of which was in a World Cup semi-final that, Australia won. And remember, the all-time great performance in the Border Gavaskar Trophy that preceded the World Cup triumph. Without wanting to bring up his nocturnal habits in tests, it did feel at times like he slept-walked through 50 over cricket. But perhaps the challenge of India's bowling woke him up a little bit. Because the only other team that Smith has a really good record against is the West Indies, where he averages 61, but with a strike rate of 79 and no hundreds. He's done all right versus Pakistan and New Zealand, averaging in the mid to low 40s. But against everyone else, it's below that. So he's an Indian specialist without doubt, red or white ball, but pretty unremarkable against everyone else. And you could argue that Smith has actually batted in every position from 3 to 8 in ODIs, and that's probably impacted his overall stats. But he really was a number 3 or a number 4 when World Cups came around for a long time. 95 of his 154 innings have come at 3, where he has been prolific. 4,369 runs, an average of 52, and a strike rate of 86. It's not quite great, but it's like pretty close to great, right? I mean, it's a little bit slow, but the average is definitely Smith-like. At first drop, he has hit 11 of his 12 ODI centuries and 27 of his 35 50s. Everywhere else in the batting order, he's averaged 29 at a strike rate of 89. Put it this way, when he bats at number 3, he's in the Ricky Ponting territory. When he bats anywhere else in the order, he's like James Hopes. And if you don't know who James Hopes is, that's kind of what I'm saying. There's something else kind of peculiar when you look at the kind of bowlers he went up against. He averaged 40 against left-arm pace and right-arm wrist spin, but striking at 78 and 84. Nothing that much to write home about. He has high average versus left-arm wrist spinners and right-arm off spinners. Again, but in a strike rate of the low 80s. And like a lot of players, he is very good against right-arm pace, averaging 41 and striking at nearly 90. But his best record came against finger spin. Again, this does not follow the pattern. In tests, slow left arm can trouble him. Here, he smashes it. His ODI self is only distantly related to his test version. Smith has a slightly better true strike rate in the first innings, but there is a significant difference in the true averages. In ODIs, he seems to prefer batting when he knows the target. And this is fascinating because in Test cricket, we've seen that he's incredible in the first innings of the match and then just gets worse as the game goes on. Even in T20s, he has a superior record batting in the first innings. I don't really know how to process that, but that's not the only thing I've ever said that about when it comes to Steve Smith. The true dots to sixes helps us figure out the profile of a batter with respect to the overs they batter. Smith is a lot better at rotating strike against spin than pace, and he also faces fewer dot balls than expected versus the slower bowlers. but he finds it much easier to score boundaries against the quicks and isn't really much of a six-hitter, which is, again, weird because in his second test match, I remember him hitting quite a few sixes. But quite clearly, Smith's template is standard. He looks to stay in during the power play, consistently knock it around in the middle, and then smash a ball at the end of the death. And if you think about it, when he learnt ODI cricket from 2005 to 2015, when he was actually learning the craft, that's exactly what you wanted a number 3 to do. In the first 10 overs, he has a true average of 13 and a true strike rate of about 8 less than expected. But remember, a wicket has fallen at that stage. Most of his runs have come in the middle, which obviously makes a lot of sense. He has a good true average here, but a par true strike rate. And then he strikes at nearly 20 more than expected at a true average of about 4 in the final 10 overs, showing that when he has to hit boundaries, he can hit them. He just doesn't really try and hit them. But it's one of the more interesting things about him that he can go when he wants to, but in ODIs and T20s, he often doesn't seem that interested in scoring fast. The Fab Four is a test cricket concept, really, but they all perform a similar role in the 50 overs as well. And of course, Virat Kohli is in a different league to these other guys. But it's very interesting to see that there isn't that much between the other three. Smith's strike rate is similar to that of Root, even if the Englishman averages a little bit more. Kane Williamson averages a lot more, but is close to 5 points behind them on strike rate. It should be pointed out the Root has 2,000 extra runs as well. But even so, their numbers aren't that dissimilar, yet Root is talked about as an ODI player an awful lot more than Smith. But remember how we talked about Smith batting everywhere in the order. How do his numbers compare to the number 3 batters with 3,000 or so runs in ODI history? Smith's average now jumped up to 51. Now we're talking. And his nearest neighbor on this graph is Kumar Sangakkara, who made about 3 times as many runs as him, of course. But you can see him a bit behind the first 2 great number 3s from Australia, Dean Jones and Pantheon. And I think this is a fairly true representation of who he is as an ODI player. His early career numbers do ruin his record a little bit. And he never quite worked out how to bat at number 4, partly because he was never there that long. But as a number 3, his average is comparable to that of Williamson and at a quicker rate. While Root averages 48 at a strike rate of 87 at 3, according to the Zulu metrics. And each one of these batters have also had a memorable World Cup campaigns in 2015, and Williamson and Root were in 2019. But when Smith won his first World Cup with Australia, he scored 402 runs at a true average of 28 and a true strike rate of 12. Just elite numbers. He actually started that tournament with a couple of low scores against England and New Zealand, batting at number 4 and number 5. That's because Australia started with Shane Watson. But after the New Zealand debacle, they moved him up the order, and he scored more than 50 5 times in a row, all on different grounds as well. The only other batter to have repeated this feat for World Cups is Virat Kohli in 2019 and 2023. But what makes Smith's accomplishments even more special is that 3 of those 50-plus scores came in World Cup knockouts. No one else has ever played a quarterfinal, semi-final, and final in the same tournament and achieved this. Of course, we haven't always had quarterfinals as well. Cricket's a confusing sport. He also has the joint most 50-plus scores, 4, in World Cup knockouts, alongside Sachin Tendulkar. It's a good person to be next to, isn't it? Smith got his scores in 6 innings while it took Tendulkar 7. The others on this graph have also played a comparable amount of knockout games. Smith's 4th knockout score above 50 was against England in the 2019 World Cup. He made 85 out of 119. England chased down that target comfortably. And of course, by that stage, one-day cricket had kind of evolved, and Smith was stuck playing the old style. But remember, in that particular game, Australia were 14 for 3 in the 7th over. And the next best score in that innings was 46 from 70 from Alex Carey. His final ODI innings was another 50 in an ICC knockout game, on brand with his legacy in this format. The only time he made a single-digit score was in the 2023 World Cup final, when he got the wrong LBW decision against Jasprit Bumrah and forgot to review it. In total, he had 1 century and 12 50s in 36 innings across the World Cup and Champions Trophy. When we look at him in 2019 and 2023 overall, he didn't really stand out when it comes to true average or strike rate. In fact, both of these values are negative for him in 2023. He scored 30 or more only 5 times out of 10, but he did play a very important innings in the semi-final against South Africa, scoring 30 off 64 in a tricky run chase, in which he kind of batted Australia into an issue and then out of an issue and then kind of back into it again. And this is actually what he was best at, scoring runs on pitches that everyone else found tough. Essentially, him and Williamson are brilliant at that. When no one else can score on a wicket, those two can probably find a run. But his overall World Cup numbers don't scream great, especially when compared to the other Australian batters with more than 500 runs. And remember, they have more than most, and a few of them were awesome. Glenn Maxwell makes this list look silly because of his scoring rate, and the same holds true for Andrew Symonds in terms of average. So if we just take them away for a minute, you see that there's a cluster of batters with a Zulu average between 55 and 60 and a Zulu strike rate in the high 90s. Smith has the lowest average, and only Jeff Marsh and Michael Bevan scored slower than him. Of course, Australia have 6 World Cup titles to name for a reason, so the bar is insanely high. How about those adjusted numbers over their full careers? Smith is now closest to Damian Martins in terms of our Zulu numbers. And Mark Waugh, Michael Clark, and David Boone aren't far off. So realistically, of those guys, the only one who really pops as an ODI player is Mark Waugh. But there are clearly a lot of players a lot better than Smith from Australia. So his World Cup legacy is confusing, and he finds it hard to stand out among the Aussies. But he was the kind of player that everyone wanted even just a few years ago. The guy who would make runs when it mattered, albeit a little bit slow. But now his entire method seems from another era. Smith calling it a day from ODIs also means that he can focus specifically on Test cricket. He has 4 tons in his last 5 tests. That's pretty good, isn't it? What if there's another mini peak coming? His T20 returns have also risen in recent times. He seems like he's taking that a little bit more seriously. And perhaps he's targeting the 2028 Olympics, which does feel like a very Steve Smith thing to do. As for ODIs, Smith's 10 innings rolling average suggests that his success in the format is nowhere near his peak years. And he'll be past 38 by the time the next World Cup comes around. And watching him play at times, I did feel strong. He's just not that into you vibes. So it makes sense for Australia to identify the next number 3 or number 4, whichever spot that they feel that they need to fill. So looking at it in terms of the Australian team, he might have timed his retirement pretty well. No matter how you view his entire career, he's definitely played a role in Australia winning white balls cricket's most coveted title twice. He wasn't the next Ricky Ponting, but he's better than your normal Marsh. He loved batting at 3 versus India at home and in World Cup knockouts, all of which culminated in his most memorable innings. And as far as careers go, those are pretty nice boxes to tick. So if you just saw those knocks, you'll rate him very high. But overall, Smith just never took apart 50 overs cricket like he can the red ball. So he's not an all-time great, rather an all-time good player when it comes to ODI cricket. South Africa did not choke. In 1906, South Africa needed 284 to win. They'd only passed 100 in half their test innings at that point. At 105 for 6, it seemed impossible. They fought back but lost another flurry, leaving 45 to win with 1 wicket in hand. At the crease was Dave Norse, who was a capable batter, and he was joined by Percy Sherwell, the only debutant captain keeper and number 11 in Test cricket history. And these two were doing it. A huge crowd in South Africa cheered on every single run. With 8 left, Sherwell edged between slips for 4. Straight after, Norse ran a 3. England bowled 3 dots. All they needed was 1 wicket to tie. Instead, a leg side full toss, boundary, game over. This was Test cricket's first 1-wicket win, and their last partnership was a record for almost 100 years. But it was also something else. This was the first Test match that South Africa had ever won. Buy my book on Amazon, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire.